The klaxon's wail pierced through the USS Leviathan like a blade through bone, and Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez felt her heart slam against her ribs as red emergency lights bathed the submarine's control room in the color of spilled blood. Water was pouring through a hairline crack in the forward bulkhead. Not enough to sink them yet, but enough to remind every soul aboard that they were 300 feet beneath the Pacific Ocean, wrapped in nothing but steel and prayer. "Damage report!" she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos as petty officers scrambled across wet deck plates, their boots splashing through the thin layer of seawater that had already begun to pool near the navigation station. The submarine groaned around them, a sound like an old building settling. Except buildings didn't have to withstand the crushing weight of the entire ocean pressing down from above. "Forward torpedo room is taking on water," called out sonar technician Rodriguez, his face pale in the crimson glow as he pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. "Hull breach, ma'am. Small, but growing." Elena's mind raced through calculations: water pressure at this depth, structural integrity of the forward compartments, time until the breach would become catastrophic. She had maybe 20 minutes before they'd be forced to surface. And surfacing meant exposing themselves to the enemy destroyers that had been hunting them for the past 6 hours. The same destroyers that had already sent 2 other American submarines to the bottom of the ocean, their crews now nothing more than memories and names on a casualty list that would be classified for the next 50 years. "Chief Martinez, get a team to the forward compartment," she ordered, watching as the grizzled veteran nodded and disappeared down the narrow passageway, his tool belt jangling against the metal walls. Martinez had been serving on submarines since before Elena was born, had survived 3 wars and countless close calls, and she trusted his steady hands more than she trusted her own heartbeat. "Rodriguez, what's our contact situation topside?" 3 surface vessels, bearing 270, range approximately 4,000 yards. Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concentration. "They're running search patterns, ma'am, waiting for us to make a mistake." Elena closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the weight of 47 lives pressing down on her shoulders, harder than the ocean pressing down on their hull. She was 31 years old, the youngest submarine commander in the Pacific Fleet, and the only woman to ever hold the position. Admiral Thornfield had made it clear from the beginning that he considered her appointment a political stunt, a box-checking exercise to appease the Pentagon's diversity initiatives. A decoration. He had called her during their last briefing, loud enough for half the officers in the room to hear. Pretty enough to put on the recruiting posters. But submarines are man's work, Lieutenant Commander. The memory burned in her chest like acid, but she pushed it down, buried it beneath layers of training and determination. She had graduated at the top of her class from the Naval War College, had spent 7 years working her way up through every position on a submarine crew, had studied naval tactics with the same intensity that other people studied religion. She knew these waters better than she knew her own apartment back in San Diego, could read sonar patterns like sheet music, could feel the ocean's moods and the subtle vibrations that traveled through the submarine's hull. "Ma'am," came a voice from behind her, and she turned to see Lieutenant Jake Morrison approaching, his usual cocky grin replaced by genuine concern. Morrison was her executive officer, a 35-year-old career naval officer who had initially resented serving under a woman commander but had gradually come to respect her tactical brilliance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, and he had a way of staying calm in crisis situations that reminded Elena of her father, who had been a submarine captain himself before cancer took him when she was 22. "Talk to me, Jake," she said, using his first name the way she always did during combat situations, a small gesture that helped maintain crew morale and reminded everyone that they were a team, not just a military hierarchy. "I've been thinking about our position," Morrison said, unfolding a navigation chart on the plotting table. The paper was already damp from the humidity that seemed to permeate everything on a submarine, and Elena could smell the familiar mixture of diesel fuel, recycled air, and human sweat that defined life beneath the surface. "Those destroyers up there, they're not just hunting randomly. They're following a pattern, trying to force us into deeper water where they can use their depth charges more effectively." Elena studied the chart, her finger tracing the contours of the ocean floor beneath them. The Pacific was deeper here than in most places, with underwater canyons that dropped down into absolute darkness. But there were also underwater mountains, rocky outcroppings that could hide a submarine if the captain was skilled enough and desperate enough to try. "What are you thinking?" "The Mendocino Ridge," Morrison said, pointing to a series of depth markings on the chart. "It's risky as hell, but there are underwater caves along the ridge that could hide us long enough to make repairs. The problem is, we'd have to navigate through a maze of rock formations in a damaged submarine, and if we miscalculate by even a few feet, we become a permanent part of the sea floor," Elena finished. She could feel the eyes of every crew member in the control room on her, waiting for her decision. These were men who had served under half a dozen different commanders, men who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts, men who had initially questioned whether a woman could lead them in battle. But over the past 8 months, she had proven herself again and again, had pulled them out of impossible situations through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. The intercom crackled, and Chief Martinez's voice filled the control room. "Control, this is Martinez. We've got the leak slowed down, but we're not going to be able to make a permanent repair until we surface. Hull integrity is compromised, and I wouldn't want to go much deeper than we already are." Elena felt a cold knot form in her stomach. They were trapped between the crushing depths below and the enemy ships above, with a damaged submarine that might not survive either option. But as she stared at the navigation chart, an idea began to form in her mind. Dangerous, unconventional, and exactly the kind of tactical thinking that had made Admiral Thornfield so uncomfortable with her command. "Rodriguez, I need you to listen very carefully to the sonar patterns from those destroyers," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Tell me everything you can about their search pattern, their speed, their coordination with each other." "Aye, ma'am," Rodriguez replied, pressing his headphones even tighter against his ears. The young sonar operator was barely 23, had joined the Navy straight out of high school, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to interpret the sounds of the ocean. Elena had seen him identify the type and nationality of a ship from nothing more than the sound of its propellers, had watched him track enemy submarines through acoustic signatures that other operators couldn't even detect. While Rodriguez worked, Elena found herself thinking about her father, Captain Miguel Vasquez, who had commanded submarines during the Cold War when the ocean was full of Soviet vessels, and every patrol was a game of 3-dimensional chess played in absolute darkness. He had taught her to think of the submarine not as a ship, but as a living thing, with its own personality and moods, its own strengths and weaknesses. "The ocean wants to kill you," he had told her when she was 15 and he was trying to talk her out of joining the Navy. "But if you learn to work with it instead of against it, sometimes it will help you kill your enemies instead." "Ma'am, I'm reading something strange," Rodriguez said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These destroyers, they're not just running a standard search pattern. They're coordinated with something else, something I can't quite identify. There's a 4th contact out there, but it's staying just at the edge of my detection range." Elena felt her pulse quicken. A 4th contact could mean anything. Another destroyer, a submarine, maybe even an aircraft carrier providing tactical coordination. But it could also mean opportunity, if she was willing to take a risk that would either save her crew or get them all killed in the next 30 minutes. The submarine shuddered around them, and Elena could hear the groan of stressed metal as the ocean pressed against their damaged hull. Somewhere in the forward compartments, Chief Martinez and his team were working frantically to reinforce the breach, but she knew they were fighting a losing battle against the fundamental laws of physics. Water would find a way in, pressure would find the weak points, and eventually the ocean would claim another submarine and another crew. Unless she did something that no one expected. "Jake, what do you know about thermal layers?" she asked, turning back to her executive officer. Morrison's eyes widened slightly. "You mean using temperature variations in the water to mask our acoustic signature?" "Ma'am, that's incredibly dangerous at this depth, and with a damaged hull." "Not to hide," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "to hunt." The control room fell silent, except for the sound of water dripping and the constant hum of the submarine's life support systems. Elena could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, the knowledge that submarine warfare had always been about patience and stealth, about hiding in the depths and striking without warning. But sometimes, when conventional tactics weren't enough, a commander had to be willing to rewrite the rules of engagement. She thought about Admiral Thornfield, sitting in his comfortable office back at Pearl Harbor, probably assuming that she would surface and surrender rather than risk her crew in a desperate gamble. She thought about the 46 men under her command, each one someone's son or brother or father, each one depending on her to bring them home alive. And she thought about the enemy destroyers above them, hunting them like wolves, hunting wounded prey, confident that they had cornered another American submarine. They were about to discover that Elena Vasquez had never been anyone's decoration. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in the pre-dawn hours of that Tuesday morning 3 months earlier, when Elena had first stepped aboard the USS Leviathan as its new commanding officer. The submarine had been docked at Pearl Harbor, its black hull gleaming with morning dew, and the crew had been assembled on deck in dress uniforms, their faces carefully neutral as they sized up the woman who would be leading them into combat. Elena remembered standing at attention as Admiral Thornfield read her orders aloud, his voice carrying across the harbor with all the warmth of a winter storm. She had worn her dress blues that day, her lieutenant commander's insignia polished to a mirror shine, her dark hair pulled back in the regulation bun that made her look older than her 31 years. The Admiral had shaken her hand for the photographers, his grip firm and brief, and had whispered under his breath, "Don't make me regret this political appointment, Commander." Now, trapped beneath the Pacific with enemy destroyers hunting them from above, Elena found herself thinking about those early weeks aboard the Leviathan, when every conversation felt like a test, and every decision was scrutinized by crew members who weren't sure they could trust their lives to a woman commander. She had been the first female officer many of them had ever served under, and the adjustment had been painful for everyone involved. Chief Petty Officer Martinez had been the worst at first, a 47-year-old veteran of 3 wars who had made it clear through subtle gestures and carefully worded comments that he believed submarines were no place for women. He had questioned her orders, double-checked her navigation calculations, and treated her more like an inexperienced junior officer than his commanding officer. It had taken a near-catastrophic training exercise off the coast of California to change his mind. Elena closed her eyes and could still feel the memory of that day in her bones. The Leviathan had been running a combat simulation when a hydraulic failure in the dive planes had sent them into an uncontrolled descent. They had been falling through the water column like a stone, passing their maximum safe depth with alarms screaming and crew members fighting panic, when Elena had made a split-second decision that had saved all their lives. Instead of trying to fight the descent with emergency ballast procedures, she had used the submarine's momentum to execute a controlled crash dive into an underwater canyon, using the rocky walls to slow their descent, while Chief Martinez and his team worked to repair the hydraulic system. It had been the kind of desperate, unconventional maneuver that Naval Academy textbooks warned against, but it had worked. They had surfaced 2 hours later with a functioning submarine and a crew that had begun to understand that their new commander was more than just a political appointment. Martinez had approached her that evening, his weathered face serious, and had said simply, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology and my respect. Both are yours for as long as you'll have me." But the real test of her leadership had come during their first combat patrol, 6 weeks ago, when they had been tasked with hunting enemy submarines in the contested waters near the Mariana Trench. The mission had been classified at the highest levels, and Elena had known that Admiral Thornfield was watching from Pearl Harbor, waiting for her to make the kind of mistake that would justify his doubts about women in submarine command. The enemy submarine had been a Kilo-class vessel, diesel-electric powered, and virtually silent when running on batteries. Elena and her crew had been tracking it for 3 days, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse in waters so deep that sunlight was just a memory. The enemy captain had been skilled, patient, and utterly ruthless, and he had nearly sunk the Leviathan twice before Elena had finally gotten a firing solution. She remembered the moment when sonar technician Rodriguez had whispered, "Contact bearing 090, range 2,000 yards, classification, hostile submarine." The control room had fallen silent, except for the soft hum of electronics and the barely audible sound of 47 people breathing. Elena had felt her heart rate slow, felt the familiar calm that came over her during combat situations, and had given the order that sent 2 Mark 48 torpedoes streaking through the water toward their target. The enemy submarine had detected the incoming torpedoes and had tried to evade, launching decoys and changing course, but Elena had anticipated the maneuver. She had ordered a second spread of torpedoes fired along the enemy captain's most likely escape route, and had been rewarded 30 seconds later by the sound of explosions echoing through the water. The enemy submarine had broken apart at a depth of 800 feet, taking all hands down with it into the eternal darkness of the deep ocean. That victory had earned her crew's absolute loyalty, but it had also brought unwanted attention from naval intelligence and from Admiral Thornfield, who had seemed almost disappointed that she had succeeded. During their debriefing at Pearl Harbor, he had questioned every aspect of her tactical decisions, had suggested that she had been reckless and unorthodox, and had made it clear that he was looking for any excuse to remove her from command. "Submarines require steady leadership, Commander," he had said, his pale blue eyes cold as winter sea ice, not flashy heroics. "Your gender is irrelevant if you can't maintain proper military discipline and follow established protocols." Elena had bitten back the response that had risen to her lips, that every great submarine commander in history had succeeded by being unorthodox, by thinking outside the boundaries of established protocols. Instead, she had simply said, "Yes, sir," and had returned to her submarine, knowing that her next mission would either prove her worth or end her career. Now, with water seeping through the Leviathan's damaged hull and enemy destroyers circling above them like sharks, Elena found herself drawing strength from those memories of struggle and doubt. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison, who had initially requested a transfer rather than serve under a female commander, but had gradually become one of her most trusted allies. She thought about Rodriguez, the young sonar technician who had grown up in poverty in East Los Angeles and had found his calling in the Navy, and who could read the ocean's sounds like poetry. She thought about Chief Martinez, who had become a father figure to the younger crew members, and who had once told her that she reminded him of his own daughter, an engineer who worked for NASA. These men had become more than just her crew. They had become her family, bound together by shared danger and mutual respect. They had learned to trust her judgment, and she had learned to trust their skills and dedication. Together, they had turned the USS Leviathan into one of the most effective attack submarines in the Pacific Fleet, and Elena knew that Admiral Thornfield's disapproval meant nothing compared to the loyalty and respect she had earned from the 46 sailors under her command. But respect and loyalty wouldn't save them from the enemy destroyers above, and Elena knew that she was facing the most challenging tactical situation of her career. The conventional response would be to surface and surrender, to accept capture rather than risk her crew's lives in a desperate gamble. It was the safe choice, the choice that Admiral Thornfield would probably approve of, the choice that would preserve naval assets and follow established protocols. Elena had never been interested in making the safe choice. She thought about her childhood in San Diego, where she had grown up in a Navy family with 3 older brothers who had all followed their father into submarine service. She had been the one who was expected to stay home, to find a nice civilian husband and raise children while the men in her family went to sea. But Elena had always been fascinated by her father's stories of life beneath the waves, had always dreamed of commanding her own submarine, and had fought every step of the way to earn her place in a profession that had been closed to women for most of its history. Her father, Captain Miguel Vasquez, had died of lung cancer during her final year at the Naval Academy, but not before he had seen her graduate at the top of her class and receive her commission as an ensign. "Mia," she whispered, using the Spanish endearment her father had always called her, "I hope I made you proud." The wind carried the sound of her voice across the campus, mixing with the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. Elena stood there for a few more minutes, feeling the presence of all the submarine commanders who had come before her, and thinking about all the officers who had come after her, men and women who would carry forward the traditions of courage, innovation, and excellence that defined the U.S. Navy's submarine force. 5 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, Elena was promoted to captain and given command of the Pacific Fleet's newest submarine squadron. Her flagship was the USS Leviathan, which had been extensively modernized and equipped with experimental weapons systems that pushed the boundaries of submarine technology. Her squadron consisted of 6 attack submarines, each commanded by officers who had been trained in the tactical innovations that Elena had pioneered. But Elena's most important assignment wasn't commanding submarines. It was training the next generation of submarine commanders. The Navy had established a new tactical development program at the Naval War College, and Elena was chosen to lead it. Her job was to identify and train officers who could think beyond conventional limitations, who could adapt to changing tactical situations, and who could lead their crews through impossible challenges. The program attracted the best and brightest officers from throughout the Navy, men and women who wanted to learn from the commander who had rewritten the rules of submarine warfare. Elena's students included foreign officers from allied navies, and her tactical innovations began spreading throughout the world's submarine forces. One of Elena's most promising students was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a 26-year-old officer who had graduated at the top of her class from the Naval Academy and had specifically requested submarine training after reading about Elena's career. Chen was brilliant, dedicated, and possessed the kind of innovative thinking that reminded Elena of herself at that age. Captain Vasquez, Chen said after one of Elena's tactical lectures, "I've been studying your engagement at Mendocino Ridge, and I have a question about your decision to surface in the middle of the enemy formation." Elena smiled, remembering her own eagerness to understand tactical decisions when she was a young officer. "What's your question, Lieutenant?" "Ma'am, the textbooks say that surfacing in the presence of enemy forces is suicide for a submarine. But you turned it into a tactical advantage. How did you know it would work?" Elena considered the question carefully. It was the same question that had been asked by countless officers, historians, and tactical analysts over the past 5 years. How do you explain intuition? How do you teach the kind of split-second decision-making that can't be learned from textbooks? "Lieutenant, the key to successful submarine command isn't following the textbooks," Elena said. "It's understanding the principles behind the textbooks and knowing when to break the rules. Those enemy destroyers were expecting us to behave like a conventional submarine, hide, evade, try to escape. By doing exactly the opposite, we achieved complete tactical surprise." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "So you're saying that the best tactical advantage is doing what the enemy doesn't expect?" "Partly," Elena replied. "But more importantly, you have to understand your own capabilities and your crew's capabilities better than the enemy understands them. I knew that my crew was capable of executing a surface attack because we had trained together, because we trusted each other, and because we were willing to attempt something that had never been done before." That conversation took place on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and Elena would remember it clearly because it was the last normal day before everything changed again. That evening, she received a classified message from the Chief of Naval Operations requesting her immediate presence in Washington for a briefing on a new threat that had emerged in the South China Sea. The briefing took place in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon, and Elena found herself sitting across from admirals, generals, and intelligence officials who looked as grim as she had ever seen military leaders look. The threat assessment they showed her was classified at the highest levels, but the basic facts were clear. A new generation of enemy submarines had been deployed, vessels that incorporated stealth technology and weapon systems that made them nearly undetectable and extremely dangerous. "Captain Vasquez," said Admiral Rebecca Morrison, the Chief of Naval Operations, "we need someone to develop new tactics for countering these threats, someone who can think outside conventional parameters and who has proven ability to innovate under pressure." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she realized what was being asked of her. "Ma'am, are you asking me to take command of a task force?" "I'm asking you to take command of the most important submarine mission since World War II," Admiral Morrison replied. "We're forming a new unit, Submarine Development Group 7. Your job will be to take our most advanced submarines and most capable crews and develop the tactics that will keep our submarine force competitive for the next 20 years. Elena accepted the assignment without hesitation, knowing that she was being given an opportunity to shape the future of submarine warfare in ways that would affect naval operations for decades to come. Within 6 months, she was back at sea, commanding a squadron of experimental submarines that incorporated technology so advanced that much of it was still classified. Her flagship was the USS Poseidon, a new class of attack submarine that could operate at depths and speeds that previous generations of submarines couldn't achieve. Her crew consisted of volunteers from throughout the submarine force, officers and enlisted personnel, who wanted to be part of the team that was redefining what submarines could accomplish. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was Elena's executive officer, having been promoted ahead of her peers because of her exceptional performance and her innovative thinking. Chief Martinez had come out of retirement to serve as Elena's senior enlisted advisor, bringing decades of experience and wisdom to the new unit. Sonar technician Rodriguez, now a chief petty officer himself, was responsible for training the next generation of sonar operators in the advanced detection techniques that Elena's unit was developing. Together, they spent 2 years testing new tactics, new technologies, and new approaches to submarine warfare. They conducted exercises in every ocean, simulated combat against the most advanced enemy systems, and pushed the boundaries of what submarines could accomplish in ways that sometimes surprised even Elena. The most significant test of their capabilities came during a classified operation in the Western Pacific, when Elena's squadron was tasked with locating and tracking 3 enemy submarines that had been operating in international waters near Allied shipping lanes. The enemy vessels were equipped with the latest stealth technology and were commanded by experienced captains who understood conventional submarine tactics. But Elena's squadron wasn't using conventional tactics. Using innovations that combined traditional submarine warfare with advanced technology and unconventional thinking, Elena's boats were able to detect, track, and simulate attacks on all 3 enemy submarines without being detected themselves. The operation was classified at the highest levels, but the results were shared with Allied navies and helped establish new standards for submarine operations worldwide. 10 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, Elena was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of all submarine operations in the Pacific. Her office was in Pearl Harbor, the same base where Admiral Thornfield had once questioned her fitness for submarine command. The irony wasn't lost on her as she sat behind a desk that had once belonged to her former critic, reviewing reports from submarine commanders throughout the Pacific Fleet. But Elena's greatest satisfaction didn't come from her own promotions or achievements. It came from watching the officers she had trained as they took command of their own submarines, as they implemented the tactical innovations she had developed, and as they trained the next generation of submarine commanders who would carry forward the traditions of excellence and innovation that had always defined the U.S. Navy's submarine force. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was now Commander Chen, commanding her own attack submarine and earning recognition as one of the most promising submarine commanders in the Navy. Chief Martinez had retired for the second time, but not before training dozens of young sailors in the traditions and values that had made the submarine force legendary. Rodriguez was now a Master Chief, responsible for sonar training throughout the Pacific Fleet, and credited with developing detection techniques that had prevented numerous enemy submarine incursions. On a warm Tuesday morning in December, 15 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, Elena stood on the deck of the USS Leviathan as the submarine prepared for its final mission before being decommissioned. The boat that had carried her through the most important battle of her career was being retired after 25 years of service, and Elena had been given the honor of commanding its final voyage. As the Leviathan slipped beneath the waves of Pearl Harbor for the last time, Elena thought about all the changes that had occurred since that desperate battle in the Pacific. The submarine force now included hundreds of female officers, many of whom commanded their own vessels. The tactical innovations that Elena had pioneered were now standard doctrine, taught in naval academies around the world. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been broken not through political mandates or social pressure, but through excellence, courage, and the simple demonstration that competence and character mattered more than gender in the depths of the ocean. 20 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, Admiral Elena Vasquez stood before a gathering of submarine commanders from Allied navies around the world. The conference was being held at the Naval War College, in the same lecture hall where her father had once taught and where she had spoken as a young commander about tactical innovation and leadership. But now Elena was no longer just a submarine commander or a tactical innovator. She was the Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. Navy, and the first woman ever to hold that position. Her appointment had been controversial in some circles, but her record of achievement and innovation had made her the obvious choice for the Navy's top leadership position. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena began, looking out at an audience that included submarine commanders from 20 different nations. Submarine warfare has always been about adaptation, innovation, and the courage to attempt what others believe is impossible. The tactics we use today were developed by commanders who were willing to break conventional rules, who trusted their crews, and who understood that the ocean rewards those who respect its power while refusing to be intimidated by its challenges. In the audience, Elena could see faces that represented the future of submarine warfare, men and women of different nationalities, backgrounds, and experiences, united by their dedication to the demanding profession of submarine command. Among them was Captain Sarah Chen, now commanding her own submarine squadron, and recognized as one of the foremost tactical thinkers in the modern Navy. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez was there too, representing the enlisted personnel whose skills and dedication made submarine operations possible. After her speech, Elena walked once again to the memorial wall where her father's name was inscribed. The wall had been expanded over the years to include the names of submarine commanders from allied nations who had given their lives in service to freedom and democracy. Elena stood quietly, thinking about the legacy that connected all submarine commanders across time and nationality, the willingness to venture into the depths of the ocean in service of something larger than themselves. "Admiral Vasquez," came a voice behind her, and Elena turned to see a young ensign approaching nervously. The young woman was wearing the dolphin insignia of a qualified submariner, and Elena could see in her eyes the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that Elena remembered from her own early career. "Yes, Ensign," Elena said, recognizing the young officer as one of the newest graduates of the submarine training program. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you," the ensign said, her voice slightly shaky with nervousness. "I joined the Navy because I read about your career, about what you accomplished at Mendocino Ridge. You proved that women could do anything in the submarine force, and you inspired a lot of us to follow in your path." Elena smiled, feeling the same sense of pride and responsibility that had motivated her throughout her career. "Ensign, the most important thing you can do is be excellent at your job, take care of your crew, and never accept limitations that others try to impose on you. The ocean doesn't care about your gender. It only cares whether you're smart enough and tough enough to survive." The young ensign nodded eagerly, and Elena could see in her eyes the same fire that had driven Elena's own career from those early days as a young lieutenant struggling to prove herself to her crew. As Elena walked back across the Naval War College campus, she thought about the conversation she'd just had and about all the young officers, male and female, who were now entering the submarine force with opportunities that hadn't existed when she was starting her career. The barriers had been broken not through quotas or mandates, but through the simple demonstration that excellence and courage were gender-neutral qualities. That evening, Elena received a message that brought her career full circle. The USS Leviathan, which had been decommissioned 15 years earlier, was being restored as a museum ship at Pearl Harbor. The Navy wanted Elena to serve as the keynote speaker at the dedication ceremony, to tell the story of the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge to future generations of naval officers and civilians. Standing on the deck of the restored submarine 6 months later, Elena looked out at an audience that included her former crew members, their families, and hundreds of naval officers who had come to honor the legacy of the USS Leviathan and the battle that had changed submarine warfare forever. Chief Martinez was there, now in his 70s but still carrying himself with the dignity and pride of a career submariner. Rodriguez was there too, along with Lieutenant Morrison, now Admiral Morrison, and dozens of other officers who had served with Elena throughout her career. But the most important person in the audience was Elena's daughter, Lieutenant Commander Maria Vasquez, who had followed her mother into the submarine force and was now serving as executive officer aboard one of the Navy's newest attack submarines. Maria had inherited her mother's tactical brilliance and her grandfather's love of the sea, and she represented the continuation of a family tradition that stretched back through 3 generations of submarine service. 25 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying across Pearl Harbor to the audience gathered on the restored submarine. The USS Leviathan and her crew faced a tactical situation that seemed impossible. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped beneath the surface by enemy forces that were confident they had cornered wounded prey. But we had something that our enemies didn't expect: the willingness to attempt tactics that had never been tried before, absolute trust in each other's abilities, and the refusal to accept defeat as long as there was breath in our bodies. Elena went on to tell the story of that desperate battle, of the surface attack that had destroyed 3 enemy destroyers, of the engagement with enemy helicopters that had redefined what submarines could accomplish. But more importantly, she talked about the lessons that could be learned from that engagement, lessons about leadership, innovation, courage, and the importance of trusting your crew to follow you through impossible challenges. As she concluded her speech, Elena looked out at the faces in her audience and saw the future of the submarine force, officers who would carry forward the traditions of excellence and innovation that had always defined naval service, who would face new challenges with the same courage and determination that had characterized submarine commanders throughout history. "Agjen, the ocean is vast and unforgiving," Elena said, her voice strong despite the emotion she felt at returning to the submarine that had shaped her career and her life. "It demands respect, skill, and courage from those who venture into its depths, but for those who are willing to meet its challenges, the ocean offers opportunities to achieve things that others believe are impossible. The USS Leviathan and her crew proved that 25 years ago, and future generations of submarine commanders will prove it again and again, in ways we can't yet imagine. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Elena stood alone on the deck of the USS Leviathan, listening to the sound of waves lapping against the submarine's hull. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pearl Harbor, and she could smell the familiar mixture of salt air and diesel fuel that had defined so much of her life. Chief Martinez approached her, moving slowly but still carrying himself with the dignity that had made him one of the finest submarine sailors Elena had ever known. "Admiral," he said, using her rank despite the informal setting, "I just wanted to say that serving under your command was the honor of my career. You taught all of us that excellence has no gender. And you proved that American submarine crews can accomplish anything when they're properly led." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she shook the hand of the man who had become a father figure to her and to countless other submarine sailors. "Chief, the honor was mine. You and the rest of the crew made me the commander I became. I never could have accomplished anything without the trust and dedication of sailors like you." As Chief Martinez walked away to rejoin his family, Elena remained on the deck of the restored submarine, thinking about the journey that had brought her from a young lieutenant struggling to prove herself to the Chief of Naval Operations. The path hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, criticism from those who questioned her abilities, and challenges that had seemed insurmountable. But through it all, she had been sustained by the knowledge that the ocean didn't care about artificial limitations, that excellence and courage were the only qualifications that mattered in the depths of the sea. The sun was setting over Pearl Harbor as Elena finally left the USS Leviathan, walking down the gangplank for what she knew would be the last time. But as she reached the dock, she turned back for one final look at the submarine that had carried her through the most important battle of her career. The boat sat quietly in the water, its black hull gleaming in the evening light, a monument to the courage and innovation that had always defined the U.S. Navy's submarine force. 30 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, the tactical innovations that Elena had pioneered were still being studied and refined by submarine commanders around the world. The surface attack techniques she had developed had been incorporated into standard doctrine, and the willingness to think beyond conventional limitations had become a defining characteristic of submarine warfare in the modern era. But Elena's greatest legacy wasn't the tactical innovations or the barriers she had broken. Her greatest legacy was the generation of officers, male and female, who now commanded submarines around the world. Officers who had learned from her example that excellence, courage, and innovation were the keys to success in any field of endeavor. Admiral Elena Vasquez retired from active duty on a warm Tuesday morning in May, exactly 40 years after she had first stepped aboard a submarine as a young ensign. Her retirement ceremony was held at the Naval Academy, where she had graduated at the top of her class so many decades earlier. The ceremony was attended by submarine commanders from around the world, by political leaders who recognized her contributions to national security, and by the families of the sailors she had commanded throughout her career. But the most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when Elena's granddaughter, Ensign Sofia Vasquez, stepped forward to receive her commission as the newest officer in the U.S. Navy. Sofia was following in the footsteps of her grandmother and mother, preparing to begin her own career in the submarine force that had shaped 3 generations of the Vasquez family. As Elena pinned the ensign's bars on her granddaughter's uniform, she whispered the same words that her father had spoken to her all those years ago. "Mija, the ocean doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It only cares if you're smart enough and tough enough to survive. You are both." Sofia smiled, her eyes bright with the excitement and determination that Elena remembered from her own early days in the Navy. "Yes, ma'am, I won't let you down." "You won't let yourself down," Elena replied. "That's what matters." As the ceremony concluded and Elena officially became a civilian for the first time in 40 years, she stood on the steps of the Naval Academy and looked out at the Severn River, where midshipmen were training in small boats under the supervision of their instructors. The scene reminded her of her own training days, when everything about naval service had seemed impossibly challenging and wonderfully exciting. Elena Vasquez had entered the Navy at a time when women were excluded from submarine service, when the very idea of a female submarine commander was considered impossible by most naval officers. She had fought through every barrier, had proven herself in combat and in peacetime, and had risen to the highest position in the U.S. Navy through excellence, innovation, and the absolute refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose on her. Now, as she began the next chapter of her life as a civilian, Elena knew that the barriers she had broken would never be rebuilt. The young women entering the submarine force today would face challenges and obstacles, but they would never face the fundamental question of whether women belonged on submarines. That question had been answered definitively 30 years earlier in the depths of the Pacific Ocean, when a young submarine commander had proven that courage and competence were the only qualifications that mattered in the service of her country. The ocean, as Elena's father had always said, didn't care about artificial limitations. It only cared about those who were smart enough and tough enough to survive its challenges and serve something larger than themselves. Elena Vasquez had been both, and her legacy would inspire generations of submarine commanders who would carry forward the traditions of excellence, innovation, and courage that had always defined naval service at its finest. The first depth charge exploded 200 yards to starboard, close enough to rattle the Leviathan's hull plates and send a shockwave through the water that Elena could feel in her teeth. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the aft compartments, something heavy crashed to the deck with a sound like breaking bones. Rodriguez jerked in his seat, his headphones sliding off one ear, and for a moment the only sound in the control room was the steady drip of water from the overhead pipes that carried coolant to the nuclear reactor. "They're getting closer," Lieutenant Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled tension. That one was almost directly overhead. Elena studied the tactical display, watching the electronic representations of the 3 enemy destroyers as they continued their methodical search pattern. Each ship was equipped with active sonar and depth charges, and they were coordinating their attacks with the precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. The 4th contact that Rodriguez had detected was still at the edge of their sonar range, but Elena was beginning to suspect it might be a command vessel, possibly a cruiser or even a small aircraft carrier providing tactical coordination for the hunting group. "Rodriguez, talk to me about that 4th contact," she said, moving to stand behind the sonar technician's station. The young man's face was pale with concentration, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the submarine's carefully controlled temperature. "What's your best guess on classification?" "Ma'am, it's hard to say for certain at this range, but the acoustic signature suggests something big. Possibly a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, but the engine sounds are different, more sophisticated." Rodriguez paused, adjusting the gain on his sonar equipment. "There's something else, ma'am. I'm picking up electronic emissions that suggest advanced radar and communication systems. This isn't just a search and destroy mission. They're gathering intelligence on our capabilities." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. If the enemy was using this engagement as a testing ground for new anti-submarine warfare techniques, then the Leviathan wasn't just fighting for its own survival. It was fighting to prevent the enemy from developing tactics that could be used against other American submarines. Every maneuver she made, every tactical decision, was potentially being recorded and analyzed by enemy naval intelligence. A second depth charge exploded, this one closer to the port side, and Elena felt the submarine heel slightly as the shock wave pushed against its hull. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and she could smell the acrid odor of electrical insulation beginning to burn somewhere in the submarine's complex systems. "Damage report," she called out, her voice cutting through the groans and creaks of stressed metal. "Forward torpedo room is holding, but we've got electrical problems in the engine room," came Chief Martinez's voice over the intercom. "Nothing critical yet, but if they keep dropping charges on us, we're going to start losing systems." Elena closed her eyes and tried to think like her father would have in this situation. Captain Miguel Vasquez had been famous throughout the submarine force for his tactical innovations, for finding ways to turn disadvantage into opportunity. He had once escaped from a Soviet-attacked submarine by hiding his boat's acoustic signature in the wake of a passing whale, and had sunk an enemy destroyer by firing torpedoes through a thermal layer that had rendered his submarine virtually invisible to sonar. "The thermal layers," she murmured, opening her eyes and turning to Morrison. "Jake, what's the water temperature at our current depth versus 100 feet deeper?" Morrison consulted his instruments, his fingers dancing across the digital displays. "Current depth. Water temperature is 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 100 feet deeper, it drops to 47 degrees. There's a pretty significant thermocline right at the 250-foot mark." Elena felt her pulse quicken. A thermocline was a layer of water where the temperature changed rapidly with depth, and it could bend sonar waves in ways that made submarines difficult to detect. But using a thermocline as cover was incredibly dangerous. It required precise navigation and perfect timing, and a single mistake could send a submarine crashing into the ocean floor. "Rodriguez, I need you to map the exact position of that thermocline," she ordered. "And I need you to tell me everything you can about the search pattern those destroyers are using. Speed, heading changes, coordination between vessels." "Aye, ma'am," Rodriguez replied, his hands flying over his controls. The destroyers are maintaining a triangular formation, with each vessel covering a sector approximately 60 degrees wide. They're changing course every 4 minutes, and they're using active sonar pings every 30 seconds. Elena began to see the tactical picture forming in her mind. The enemy destroyers were being methodical, professional, and predictable. Exactly the kind of by-the-book approach that naval academies taught, but that could be exploited by a commander willing to take calculated risks. If she could use the thermocline to mask the Leviathan's approach, she might be able to get close enough to one of the destroyers to launch a torpedo attack before the others could react. It was the kind of aggressive, unconventional tactic that Admiral Thornfield would have called reckless, the kind of maneuver that could either save her crew or get them all killed in the next 20 minutes. "Jake, I want you to plot a course that takes us down to the thermocline and then toward the nearest destroyer," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're going to use their own search pattern against them." Morrison's eyes widened. "Ma'am, with respect, that's extremely dangerous. If they detect us before we reach firing position, they'll blow us out of the water," Elena finished. "But if we stay here and let them bracket us with depth charges, we're dead anyway. At least this way, we go down fighting." The third depth charge exploded directly overhead, close enough to make the entire submarine ring like a bell. Elena felt her ears pop from the pressure wave, and several of the electronic displays flickered and went dark before coming back online. In the forward compartments, she could hear Chief Martinez shouting orders to his damage control team, and she knew that their time was running out. "Chief Martinez, this is the captain," she said into the intercom microphone. "How long can the hull integrity hold up under this kind of punishment?" "Ma'am, we've got stress fractures forming in 3 different bulkheads," Martinez replied, his voice strained. "I can't give you an exact timeline, but I wouldn't want to take many more hits like that last one." Elena looked around the control room at her crew. These men had followed her through training exercises and combat missions, had learned to trust her judgment even when it went against conventional wisdom. Lieutenant Morrison was still studying the navigation charts, his jaw set with determination despite his obvious concerns about her tactical plan. Rodriguez was bent over his sonar console, mapping the thermocline with the precision of a surgeon. Throughout the submarine, 44 other sailors were doing their jobs with quiet professionalism, trusting that their commander would find a way to bring them home. She thought about Admiral Thornfield, sitting in his comfortable office at Pearl Harbor, probably assuming that she would surface and surrender rather than risk her crew in a desperate gamble. She thought about the enemy naval intelligence officers who were probably recording every sound the Leviathan made, analyzing her tactics for use against future American submarines. And she thought about her father's words from all those years ago. "The ocean doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It only cares if you're smart enough and tough enough to survive." "All right, people, listen up," Elena said, her voice carrying to every corner of the control room. "We're going to do something that the textbooks say is impossible. We're going to use a thermocline to mask our approach, and we're going to put a torpedo into one of those destroyers before they know we're coming. It's going to require perfect timing, perfect navigation, and a little bit of luck. But if it works, we're going to show these bastards what American submarine tactics look like." The crew responded with the kind of quiet determination that Elena had come to expect from them. Morrison began calculating the approach course, Rodriguez fine-tuned his sonar readings, and, throughout the submarine, men prepared for the kind of desperate gamble that had defined submarine warfare since the first underwater vessels had prowled the depths during World War II. But as Elena watched the tactical display, she realized that the enemy destroyers weren't the only threat they faced. The fourth contact, the mysterious command vessel that Rodriguez had detected, was beginning to move, changing position in a way that suggested it was coordinating the search effort with increasing sophistication. If that vessel was indeed a cruiser equipped with advanced sonar systems, Elena's plan to use the thermocline as cover might not work at all. "Rodriguez, that fourth contact is moving," she said, pointing to the sonar display. "Can you get me a better classification?" The young sonar technician adjusted his controls, his face creased with concentration. "Ma'am, I'm reading multiple contacts now. The fourth vessel has launched something, possibly helicopters or unmanned aerial vehicles. They're setting up a coordinated air-sea search operation." Elena felt her heart sink. Helicopters equipped with dipping sonar could detect submarines even when they were hiding beneath thermoclines. And unmanned aerial vehicles could coordinate with surface vessels to create a three-dimensional hunting net that would be almost impossible to escape. The tactical situation had just shifted from dangerous to nearly hopeless. A fourth depth charge exploded, this one close enough to the port side to knock several crew members off their feet. Elena grabbed the periscope housing to steady herself, and she could feel the submarine's hull flexing under the pressure of the explosion. Somewhere in the aft compartments, an alarm began sounding, and she could hear Chief Martinez's voice over the intercom, reporting damage to the main electrical systems. "Ma'am, we've lost power to the forward torpedo room," Martinez called out. "I can get it back, but it's going to take time." Elena closed her eyes and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. Without power to the torpedo room, they couldn't launch an attack on the enemy destroyers. Without the ability to attack, they were trapped beneath the surface, slowly taking damage from depth charges, while enemy helicopters closed in from above. She was facing the kind of tactical situation that had no good solutions, the kind of crisis that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. But as she stood in the red-lit control room of her damaged submarine, listening to the sounds of her crew working desperately to keep their vessel operational, Elena began to formulate a plan that was so audacious, so completely contrary to established submarine warfare doctrine, that it might actually work. It would require split-second timing, absolute trust from her crew, and a willingness to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. It was exactly the kind of plan her father would have loved. "Rodriguez, I need you to listen very carefully," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she leaned over the sonar technician's shoulder. "Forget everything you know about conventional submarine tactics. I want you to help me turn this boat into something the enemy has never seen before." The young man looked up at her with confusion and growing excitement in his dark eyes. Around them, the control room hummed with tension as Chief Martinez's voice continued to crackle over the intercom, reporting on damage control efforts throughout the submarine. The red emergency lighting cast everything in bloody shadows, and Elena could smell the acrid scent of overheated electronics mixing with the ever-present odors of diesel fuel and recycled air. "Ma'am, what do you have in mind?" Rodriguez asked, his fingers still dancing across his sonar controls as he maintained their watch on the enemy vessels circling above them. Elena pulled out a tactical manual from the navigation station, its pages worn from years of study and marked with her father's handwritten notes in the margins. She had carried this book through every assignment, every training exercise, every moment of doubt about her chosen career path. It contained the accumulated wisdom of submarine warfare dating back to World War II, but what Elena was planning wasn't in any manual ever written. "Jake, come here," she called to Lieutenant Morrison, who was still bent over the navigation charts. "I want you to calculate something for me, and I want you to trust me, even if it sounds completely insane." Morrison approached, his weathered face serious with concern. "Ma'am, whatever you're thinking, we need to consider the structural integrity of the hull. Another few depth charges, and we might not have a choice about surfacing." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Elena said, and she saw Morrison's eyes widen as he began to understand the direction of her thoughts. "Rodriguez, those destroyers above us, they're maintaining a search pattern that assumes we're trying to hide, trying to evade, trying to run. What if we did exactly the opposite?" The sonar technician paused in his work, his hands frozen above his controls. "Ma'am, you mean attack?" "Not attack," Elena said, her voice gaining strength as the tactical plan crystallized in her mind. "Hunt. Jake, I want you to calculate the exact ballast adjustments needed to make this submarine neutrally buoyant at a depth of 50 feet. And I want you to do it in a way that makes us rise slowly, almost imperceptibly, so that their sonar operators think we're just debris floating up from the depths." Morrison stared at her as if she had suggested they sprout wings and fly. "Ma'am, 50 feet? That puts us practically on the surface. Those destroyers will be able to see us visually, never mind sonar contact." Only if they're looking in the right direction, Elena replied. She turned to Rodriguez, whose face was now showing the beginnings of understanding and excitement. Son, I need you to map the exact positions of those 3 destroyers and predict their search pattern for the next 10 minutes. And I need you to find me the blind spot, the one place where their sonar coverage overlaps in a way that creates a shadow zone. Rodriguez's fingers flew over his controls, and Elena could see him processing the tactical information with the speed and precision that had made him one of the finest sonar technicians in the Pacific Fleet. Ma'am, there's a convergence zone approximately 800 yards northwest of our current position. The way their search patterns intersect, there's a gap in coverage that lasts for approximately 90 seconds every 4 minutes. Elena felt her pulse quicken. 90 seconds wasn't much time, but it might be enough for what she had in mind. Rodriguez, when is the next window? 6 minutes and 20 seconds from now, he replied, his voice tight with concentration. Elena turned to Morrison, who was still staring at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Jake, I need you to understand something. Everything we've been taught about submarine warfare assumes that we're trying to stay hidden, trying to avoid detection. But what if detection is exactly what we want? Ma'am, I don't understand, Morrison said, though Elena could see the gears turning in his mind as he tried to follow her tactical reasoning. Those destroyers up there think they're hunting a wounded submarine that's trying to escape, Elena explained, her voice gaining confidence as the plan solidified in her mind. They're expecting us to run deep, to hide, to try to sneak away. They're not expecting us to surface in the middle of their formation and launch torpedoes at point-blank range. The control room fell silent, except for the constant drip of water and the hum of electronic equipment. Elena could see her crew processing the implications of what she was suggesting. A surface attack by a submarine, conducted at such close range that the enemy would have no time to react. It was the kind of desperate, audacious tactic that naval historians would either call brilliant or suicidal, depending on whether it worked. Ma'am, Chief Martinez's voice crackled over the intercom, I'm showing serious structural damage in 3 compartments. We need to surface soon, or we're going to lose hull integrity completely. Elena keyed the intercom microphone. Chief, how long do you need to restore power to the forward torpedo room? Give me 3 minutes, ma'am, but I can't guarantee the tubes will cycle properly under combat conditions. Do your best, Chief. We're going to need every torpedo we've got. Elena turned back to Rodriguez, who was monitoring the enemy's search patterns with intense concentration. Son, I need you to give me real-time updates on those destroyer positions, and I need you to track that 4th contact. If it's coordinating this search operation, I want to know the moment it changes position. Aye, ma'am, Rodriguez replied. The 4th contact appears to be maintaining station approximately 6,000 yards to the northeast. Electronic signatures suggest it's definitely a command vessel, possibly equipped with advanced sonar processing capabilities. Elena nodded, filing that information away for later consideration. The presence of a command vessel complicated things, but it also presented an opportunity. If she could eliminate or damage the command ship, the 3 destroyers might lose their tactical coordination and become easier targets. But first, she had to get the Leviathan into position without being detected. Jake, start your ballast calculations, she ordered. I want us rising slowly toward 50 feet, but I want it to look like natural buoyancy changes, not power descent. Can you do that? Morrison was already working, his hands moving across the ballast control panel with practiced precision. Ma'am, I can give you a gradual ascent that should look like debris or thermal layering, but once we reach 50 feet, we're going to be visible to any destroyer with decent surface radar. That's the point, Elena said. Rodriguez, how long until the next coverage gap? 4 minutes, 30 seconds, ma'am. Elena felt her heartbeat slow into the rhythm that always came over her during combat situations. Time seemed to stretch, each second becoming crystal clear as she visualized the tactical maneuver she was about to attempt. The Leviathan would rise slowly through the water column, timing its ascent to reach near-surface depth just as the enemy destroyers. Search patterns created a temporary blind spot. Then, in the span of 90 seconds, Elena would have to identify targets, achieve firing solutions, and launch torpedoes before the enemy realized what was happening. It was the kind of maneuver that required perfect execution from every member of her crew, the kind of desperate gamble that would either save their lives or ensure that the USS Leviathan became another name on the casualty lists. Chief Martinez, this is the captain, Elena said into the intercom. I need you to prepare for emergency surface procedures, but I need you to do it quietly. No unnecessary noise, no rapid ballast changes. We're going to try something that's never been done before." "Understood, ma'am," Martinez replied, and Elena could hear the confidence in his voice despite the desperate nature of their situation. Over the past 8 months, Chief Martinez had learned to trust her tactical instincts, had seen her pull the crew out of impossible situations through a combination of skill, determination, and willingness to think outside conventional doctrine. Elena moved to the periscope station and began calculating angles and distances in her head. At 50 feet depth, the Leviathan's periscope would be just below the surface, giving her visual confirmation of target positions. She would have to identify the most valuable targets, achieve firing solutions on multiple destroyers simultaneously, and coordinate the torpedo launches with split-second precision. "Ma'am," Rodriguez called out, his voice tense with excitement, "I'm reading changes in the search pattern. The destroyers are beginning their next sweep cycle." "Time to coverage gap?" Elena asked. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. Elena felt the familiar calm settling over her, the same focused concentration that had carried her through every crisis of her naval career. She thought about her father, Captain Miguel Vasquez, who had taught her that submarine warfare was as much about psychology as it was about technology. The enemy destroyers above them were operating under certain assumptions about submarine behavior, and Elena was about to shatter every one of those assumptions. "Jake, begin the ascent," she ordered, slow and steady, just like we discussed. Elena could feel the subtle change in the submarine's attitude as Morrison adjusted the ballast tanks, releasing just enough water to give the Leviathan positive buoyancy. The ascent was so gradual that it would be almost impossible to detect on sonar. To enemy operators, it would look like natural ocean currents or thermal changes rather than a submarine under power. "Rodriguez, give me constant updates on destroyer positions," Elena said, moving to stand behind the sonar technician's station, "and keep tracking that command vessel. If it starts moving toward our position, I need to know immediately." "Aye, ma'am. Destroyers are maintaining formation, still following their search pattern. Command vessel appears to be stationary." Elena watched the depth gauge as the numbers slowly decreased, 200 feet, 190, 180. Each foot brought them closer to the surface and closer to detection, but it also brought them closer to the kind of tactical advantage that could turn the entire engagement in their favor. "Ma'am," Chief Martinez's voice came over the intercom. "Power restored to forward torpedo room, all tubes ready for loading." "Load tubes 1 through 4 with Mark 48 torpedoes," Elena ordered. "Set for contact detonation, high explosive warheads. And, Chief, I need those torpedoes ready to fire the moment we reach firing position." "Understood, ma'am. Tubes 1 through 4 loading now." Elena could hear the mechanical sounds of torpedo loading echoing through the submarine's hull, the whir of electric motors, the clank of heavy ordnance being moved into position, the hiss of compressed air systems being pressurized. It was the sound of a submarine preparing for battle, and Elena felt a fierce pride in her crew's professionalism and dedication. "Depth now 120 feet, Morrison reported. Ascent rate steady at 2 feet per minute. Rodriguez, time to coverage gap." 1 minute 15 seconds, ma'am." Elena moved to the attack periscope and began her final preparations. In 60 seconds, she would raise the periscope above the surface and attempt to visually acquire targets in broad daylight, while enemy destroyers circled less than 1,000 yards away. It was the kind of exposure that conventional submarine doctrine strictly prohibited, but Elena had never been interested in following conventional doctrine when lives were on the line. "Torpedoes loaded and ready in all tubes," came Chief Martinez's voice. "Firing solutions can be input as soon as we have target bearings." "Outstanding, Chief," Elena replied. She could feel the tension in the control room building as her crew prepared for the most dangerous 90 seconds of their lives. "Rodriguez, give me final positions on all enemy vessels." "Destroyer 1, bearing 045, range approximately 1,000 yards. Destroyer 2, bearing 180, range 1,200 yards. Destroyer 3, bearing 270, range 800 yards. Command vessel bearing 090, range 6,000 yards. Elena processed the tactical picture in her mind, visualizing the positions of the enemy ships relative to the Leviathan's ascent path. Destroyer 3 was the closest target and would have to be engaged first to prevent it from ramming the submarine. Destroyer 1 was in an excellent position for a torpedo attack, and Destroyer 2 was far enough away that Elena might be able to achieve a firing solution before it could react to the attack. Depth now 80 feet, Morrison reported, still ascending steady. Rodriguez, time to coverage gap? 30 seconds, ma'am. Elena gripped the periscope controls, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. In 30 seconds, she would attempt a maneuver that no submarine commander had ever tried in combat, a surface attack conducted at point-blank range against multiple enemy vessels. If it worked, the USS Leviathan would achieve one of the most devastating submarine attacks in naval history. If it failed, Elena and her 46 crew members would be dead within minutes. All stations report ready for combat, she announced to the control room. We're about to show these bastards what American submarine warfare looks like. The depth gauge read 70 feet and still decreasing. Elena could feel her crew's absolute confidence in her leadership, could sense their readiness to follow her into the kind of desperate battle that would either make them heroes or martyrs. She thought about Admiral Thornfield's dismissive comments about her abilities, about his assumption that women couldn't handle the pressure of submarine command. In a few minutes, Admiral Thornfield was going to learn that he had severely underestimated Elena Vasquez. "Ma'am," Rodriguez whispered, his voice tight with excitement. "Coverage gap begins, now." Elena took a deep breath and reached for the periscope controls. Up periscope. All stations, prepare for surface attack. The periscope broke the surface of the Pacific Ocean like a silver needle piercing blue silk, and Elena found herself looking at a scene that would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. 3 enemy destroyers were visible on the horizon, their gray hulls cutting through moderate swells under a brilliant afternoon sun. The nearest vessel was less than 800 yards away, close enough that Elena could see individual crew members moving around the deck, close enough that she could read the hull numbers painted on the ship's bow. "Bearing mark," Elena called out, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Destroyer bearing 270, range 800 yards, angle on the bow starboard 90 degrees. Lieutenant Morrison was already inputting the firing solution into the torpedo control system, his fingers flying across the digital displays with practiced precision. "Solution ready, Tube 1? Fire at Tube 1, Elena ordered, and she felt the submarine shudder slightly as the Mark 48 torpedo launched from its tube and streaked through the water toward the unsuspecting destroyer. The weapon was programmed for a contact detonation, and at this range, the enemy vessel would have less than 30 seconds to detect the incoming torpedo and attempt evasive maneuvers. Elena swung the periscope to the left, acquiring the second target. "Bearing mark." Destroyer bearing 045, range 1,000 yards, angle on the bowport 45 degrees. "Solution ready, Tube 2, Morrison called out. "Fire Tube 2. The second torpedo launched with the same mechanical precision as the first, and Elena could see its wake cutting through the surface as it raced toward its target. The enemy destroyer was beginning to turn, its crew apparently having spotted the torpedo from the first attack. But Elena knew that the physics of naval warfare were now working in her favor. A destroyer traveling at 20 knots needed time and distance to change course, and at these ranges, time was a luxury the enemy didn't have. "Rodriguez, status on that command vessel?" Elena asked, keeping her eye pressed to the periscope as she searched for the third destroyer. "Command vessel is beginning to move, ma'am. Bearing 090, increasing speed. Appears to be moving to intercept." Elena felt her heart race. If the command vessel was indeed a cruiser equipped with advanced weapons systems, it could engage the Leviathan with guided missiles or rapid-fire cannons that would tear through the submarine's hull like paper. She needed to eliminate the immediate threats and get her submarine back beneath the surface before the command vessel could reach weapons range. "Bearing mark," she called out, acquiring the third destroyer through the periscope. "Destroyer bearing 180, range 1,200 yards, angle on the bow port 60 degrees. "Solution ready, Tube 3, Morrison responded. "Fire Tube 3. The third torpedo launched just as the first one reached its target. Elena watched through the periscope as the Mark 48 warhead detonated against the destroyer's hull amidships, sending a massive column of fire and smoke into the afternoon sky. The explosion was so violent that she could feel the shockwave travel through the water and vibrate through the Leviathan's hull. The enemy destroyer began listing immediately to starboard, its back broken by the torpedo's devastating impact. "Direct hit on Target 1?" Rodriguez called out, his voice filled with excitement. "She's going down!" Elena kept her eye pressed to the periscope, watching as the second torpedo raced toward its target. The destroyer was turning desperately, trying to present its narrow bow profile to the incoming weapon, but the torpedo's guidance system was tracking the ship's movement with deadly precision. The Mark 48 struck the destroyer just aft of the bridge, and Elena watched as the explosion tore a massive hole in the vessel's superstructure, sending debris and flame hundreds of feet into the air. "Second target hit," Morrison reported. "Massive damage, she's dead in the water." Elena swung the periscope toward the third destroyer, which was now turning toward the Leviathan's position at flank speed, its bow cutting through the swells as it raced to ram the submarine before the third torpedo could reach its target. It was going to be close. The destroyer was accelerating rapidly, and the torpedo still had several hundred yards to travel. "Come on," Elena whispered, watching the deadly race between torpedo and warship play out across the Pacific surface. The destroyer's captain was skilled and desperate, using every trick in the book to evade the incoming weapon. But the Mark 48 torpedo was one of the most sophisticated anti-ship weapons ever developed. Its guidance system tracked the destroyer's acoustic signature, its speed, and its course changes, constantly adjusting its own trajectory to ensure an intercept. The torpedo struck the destroyer's bow just as the ship reached ramming distance, and Elena watched through the periscope as the explosion lifted the vessel's entire forward section out of the water before dropping it back into the ocean in a shower of twisted metal and burning fuel. The destroyer's momentum carried it forward for another few hundred yards before it began to settle by the bow, its crew abandoning ship as seawater poured through the massive breach in its hull. "All three destroyers neutralized," Rodriguez called out, his voice filled with amazement and pride. "Ma'am, I've never seen anything like that in my life." Elena felt a surge of fierce satisfaction, but she knew their battle wasn't over. The command vessel was still out there, still approaching at high speed, and the Leviathan was exposed on the surface like a sitting duck. "Down periscope! Jake, take us down fast. Emergency dive procedures." Morrison was already opening the ballast tank vents, flooding the tanks with seawater to give the submarine negative buoyancy. Elena could feel the Leviathan's bow angling downward as they began their descent. But she knew it would take precious time to reach safe depth. Time during which the command vessel could close the distance and engage them with surface weapons. "Rodriguez, give me constant updates on that command vessel," Elena ordered. "Contact bearing 090, range 4,000 yards and closing fast." "Ma'am, I'm reading multiple contacts launching from the command vessel. Looks like helicopters." Elena felt her blood turn cold. Helicopters equipped with dipping sonar and anti-submarine torpedoes could attack the Leviathan even after it reached safe depth. She had eliminated the immediate threat from the destroyers, but now she was facing a new tactical situation that could still get her crew killed. "Depth 60 feet and increasing," Morrison reported. "But those helicopters are going to reach our position before we can get deep enough to avoid detection." Elena closed her eyes and tried to think like her father would have in this situation. Captain Miguel Vasquez had always taught her that the key to submarine warfare was turning disadvantages into advantages, finding ways to use the enemy's strengths against them. The helicopters were fast and maneuverable, but they were also vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire if she could get the Leviathan's surface weapons operational. "Chief Martinez, this is the captain," Elena said into the intercom. "Do we have power to the deck gun mount?" "Ma'am, the 5-inch gun is operational, but we'd have to surface to use it," Martinez replied. "And ma'am, those helicopters will tear us apart if we stay on the surface." Elena felt the familiar calm settling over her as a new tactical plan began to form in her mind. It was even more audacious than the surface attack she had just completed, and it would require perfect timing and absolute trust from her crew. "Jake, I want you to stop our descent at 40 feet and hold us there," she ordered. "Rodriguez, I need precise tracking on those helicopters. Distance, bearing, speed, everything you can give me." "Ma'am, what are you thinking?" Morrison asked, though Elena could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand the direction of her tactical reasoning. "Those helicopters are expecting us to run deep and hide," Elena said, her voice gaining confidence as the plan crystallized. "They're not expecting us to fight back." "Chief Martinez, can you get a crew to the deck gun in 90 seconds? "Ma'am, that's suicide," Martinez protested over the intercom. "Those helicopters will spot us the moment we surface." "That's exactly what I want them to do," Elena replied. "Rodriguez, how long until those helicopters reach our position?" 2 minutes, 30 seconds at current speed, ma'am." Elena felt her pulse quicken. If she surfaced the Leviathan and engaged the helicopters with the deck gun, she would be exposing her submarine to devastating counterattack. But if she could destroy or damage the helicopters before they could launch their torpedoes, she might be able to eliminate the last threat to her crew's survival. "All hands, this is the captain," Elena announced over the ship's general announcing system. "We're about to surface and engage enemy helicopters with our deck gun. All non-essential personnel take cover in interior compartments. Gun crew to the deck gun mount on the double." Elena could hear the sound of running feet and slamming watertight doors as her crew prepared for the most desperate gamble of their lives. The USS Leviathan was about to become the first submarine in naval history to conduct a surface engagement against enemy aircraft, and Elena knew that the next few minutes would either make her crew heroes or ensure that they all died together in the depths of the Pacific Ocean. "Ma'am," Chief Martinez's voice came over the intercom, "gun crew ready. But I want to go on record as saying this is the craziest thing I've ever seen in 25 years of submarine service." Elena smiled grimly. "Noted, Chief. Jake, bring us to periscope depth and prepare for emergency surface." As the Leviathan rose through the water column toward its final confrontation with the enemy, Elena thought about Admiral Thornfield and his dismissive comments about her abilities. In a few minutes, Admiral Thornfield was going to receive a radio report about a female submarine commander who had single-handedly destroyed an entire enemy task force using tactics that weren't in any naval warfare manual ever written. The ocean didn't care if she was a man or a woman. It only cared if she was smart enough and tough enough to survive. Elena Vasquez was both. The USS Leviathan broke the surface of the Pacific Ocean like a black steel mountain rising from the depths, seawater cascading from its hull as the emergency ballast systems drove the submarine upward with mechanical violence. Elena gripped the periscope housing as the boat rolled heavily in the moderate swells, feeling the strange sensation of natural sunlight streaming through the control room for the first time in 8 hours. Through the periscope, she could see the enemy helicopters approaching from the northeast, their rotors glinting in the afternoon sun as they raced toward what they assumed would be an easy kill. They were about to discover how wrong they were. "Gun crew on deck!" Chief Martinez's voice crackled over the intercom, and Elena could hear the clatter of boots on metal as 5 sailors raced to man the 5-inch deck gun that had been installed on the Leviathan during its last refit. The weapon was designed primarily for shore bombardment, but Elena was betting that it could be effective against low-flying aircraft if her gunners were skilled enough and lucky enough. "Rodriguez, give me range and bearing to the nearest helicopter," Elena called out. "Contact bearing 040, range 2,000 yards, closing fast," Rodriguez replied, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Second contact bearing 060, range 2,500 yards." Elena watched through the periscope as the lead helicopter began to slow, its crew apparently spotting the surface submarine and preparing to launch anti-submarine torpedoes. The aircraft was a sophisticated military helicopter, equipped with advanced sensors and weapon systems, and Elena knew that her gunners would have only one chance to hit it before it could destroy the Leviathan. "Gun mount. This is the captain," Elena said into the sound-powered phone that connected her to the deck gun crew. "Target bearing 040, range 2,000 yards. Helicopter moving left to right across our bow. You are authorized to fire when ready." The 5-inch gun rotated with mechanical precision, its barrel elevation changing as the gunners tracked their target through the weapon's optical sights. Elena had never seen a submarine engage aircraft with deck guns, had never even heard of such a thing being attempted, but she knew that her crew was capable of adapting to any tactical situation. The gun fired with a sound like thunder, sending a high-explosive shell screaming across the water toward the approaching helicopter. Elena watched through the periscope as the round exploded in an orange fireball just behind the aircraft, close enough to damage its tail rotor and send it spinning toward the ocean's surface. The helicopter crashed into the Pacific with a tremendous splash, and Elena felt a surge of fierce satisfaction as she watched debris scattered across the water. "Direct hit," Rodriguez called out. "First helicopter down." But the second helicopter was already launching its attack, and Elena could see the sleek shape of an anti-submarine torpedo dropping from the aircraft's weapons bay. The torpedo hit the water with a small splash and immediately began its run toward the Leviathan, its guidance system homing in on the submarine's acoustic signature. "Torpedo in the water," Rodriguez shouted. "Bearing 060, range 1,500 yards." Elena felt her heart race as she calculated angles and distances in her head. The incoming torpedo was a modern weapon, fast and maneuverable, and it would reach the Leviathan in less than 60 seconds. But the submarine was on the surface, which meant that Elena had options that wouldn't be available if they were submerged. "All ahead flank," she ordered. "Right full rudder." The Leviathan's nuclear reactor poured power into its propulsion system, and Elena could feel the submarine accelerating as it turned hard to starboard. On the surface, the boat was faster and more maneuverable than it would be underwater, and Elena was gambling that she could evade the incoming torpedo through speed and course changes. "Gun mount, target the second helicopter," Elena called out. "Bearing 060, range 3,000 yards." The deck gun traversed toward the new target as the gunners worked with desperate efficiency. Elena could see the second helicopter maneuvering for another torpedo attack, its crew apparently confident that their first weapon would eliminate the submarine before the Leviathan's gun crew could engage effectively. The 5-inch gun fired again, this time scoring a direct hit on the helicopter's main rotor assembly. Elena watched through the periscope as the aircraft disintegrated in midair, its wreckage raining down into the ocean in a shower of burning metal and aviation fuel. The explosion was so violent that she could feel the shock wave travel across the water and vibrate through the submarine's hull. "Second helicopter destroyed," Rodriguez reported, his voice filled with amazement and pride. But the first torpedo was still racing toward them, and Elena could see its wake cutting through the surface as it closed the final few hundred yards to impact. The weapon was tracking the Leviathan's acoustic signature with deadly precision, adjusting its course to match the submarine's evasive maneuvers. "Jake, I need you to do something that's going to sound completely insane," Elena said, turning to her executive officer. "I want you to activate the emergency blow system and launch us out of the water like a breaching whale." Morrison stared at her as if she had suggested they sprout wings and fly. "Ma'am, the emergency blow system isn't designed for that kind of maneuver. We could damage the hull, lose ballast control." "Do it," Elena ordered. "Full emergency blow, all tanks, maximum rate." Morrison's hands flew across the ballast control panel, opening every valve and activating every pump in the submarine's ballast system. Elena could hear the roar of compressed air being forced into the ballast tanks at maximum pressure, driving seawater out through the submarine's hull with incredible violence. The USS Leviathan lurched upward like a massive steel whale breaching the surface, its entire hull rising 20 feet above the ocean before crashing back down with tremendous force. The incoming torpedo, programmed to track the submarine's acoustic signature, lost its target lock when the Leviathan left the water and detonated harmlessly in the submarine's wake. "Torpedo missed," Rodriguez called out, his voice barely audible over the sound of water crashing across the submarine's hull as it settled back into the ocean. Elena felt a moment of pure triumph as she realized that they had survived the impossible, a surface engagement between a submarine and enemy aircraft that had ended in complete victory for the Leviathan. But even as she savored the moment, she knew that their mission was far from over. The command vessel was still out there, probably calling for reinforcements, and Elena needed to get her submarine back beneath the surface before more enemy forces could arrive. "Damage report," she called out, as the submarine rolled heavily in the swells. "All compartments reporting minor damage only," Chief Martinez replied over the intercom. "Hull integrity is good, all systems operational." "Ma'am, I don't know how you pulled that off, but it worked." Elena felt a surge of pride in her crew, and in the submarine they had turned into a weapon of unprecedented capability. The USS Leviathan had just achieved one of the most devastating attacks in submarine warfare history, destroying 3 enemy destroyers and 2 helicopters without suffering a single casualty. "Rodriguez, status on that command vessel?" Elena asked. "Contact bearing 090, range 8,000 yards, appears to be withdrawing at high speed," Rodriguez replied. "Ma'am, I think we scared them off." Elena smiled grimly. The enemy command vessel was probably radioing a report about a submarine commander who had used tactics that defied every principle of naval warfare. tactics that would be studied in naval academies for decades to come. Admiral Thornfield was going to receive a very interesting briefing when the Leviathan returned to Pearl Harbor. "Take us down to periscope depth," Elena ordered. "Set course for Pearl Harbor. Best speed." As the USS Leviathan submerged beneath the Pacific surface for the journey home, Elena stood in the control room and looked around at the faces of her crew. These men had followed her through the most desperate battle of their lives, had trusted her judgment even when her tactics seemed to border on suicide, had proven that American submarine crews were capable of adapting to any tactical situation. Lieutenant Morrison approached her, his weathered face showing a mixture of exhaustion and admiration. "Ma'am, what you accomplished today! I've never seen anything like it. You turned submarine warfare into something completely new." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of what they had achieved beginning to settle on her shoulders. "Jake, what we did today wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about proving that innovation and courage can overcome any tactical disadvantage. The Navy is going to study this engagement for years, and other submarine commanders are going to learn from what we accomplished." Chief Martinez's voice came over the intercom. "Captain, all compartments secure for transit. We're ready for the journey home." Elena keyed the microphone. "Outstanding work, Chief. Outstanding work from everyone. You've all earned your place in naval history today." As the USS Leviathan headed east toward Pearl Harbor, Elena found herself thinking about her father and the lessons he had taught her about submarine warfare. Captain Miguel Vasquez had always believed that the best commanders were those who could think beyond conventional tactics, who could find ways to turn disadvantage into opportunity. Today, Elena had proven that his daughter had inherited more than just his love of the sea. She had inherited his ability to rewrite the rules of naval warfare when the situation demanded it. 3 days later, the USS Leviathan arrived at Pearl Harbor to a hero's welcome that surprised everyone, including Elena herself. Admiral Thornfield was waiting on the dock, his face carefully neutral as he watched the submarine that had achieved one of the most spectacular victories in Pacific Fleet history. The media was there too, drawn by reports of a female submarine commander who had single-handedly destroyed an entire enemy task force using tactics that weren't in any military manual. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came from watching her crew as they walked down the gangplank to reunite with their families. These men had learned to trust her leadership, had followed her through impossible battles, and had proven that the U.S. Navy's submarine force was ready for a new generation of commanders who thought beyond conventional limitations. Admiral Thornfield approached her as she prepared to leave the submarine for the first time in 2 weeks. His pale blue eyes were unreadable, but Elena could sense that his attitude toward her had changed fundamentally. "Commander Vasquez," he said, his voice carefully formal, "I've read the preliminary reports of your engagement. Quite unconventional." Elena met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. The tactical situation required innovative solutions." Admiral Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. "Commander, I owe you an apology. I misjudged your capabilities, and I was wrong to suggest that your command assignment was merely political. What you accomplished out there," he paused, seeming to struggle for words, "it's going to change how we think about submarine warfare." Elena felt a surge of vindication, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you, sir. My crew performed exceptionally under very difficult circumstances." "Your crew, yes," Admiral Thornfield said, "but the tactical decisions were yours, the courage was yours, the innovation was yours." He extended his hand, and Elena shook it, feeling the genuine respect in his grip. "Commander, I'd like to discuss your next assignment. The Navy needs officers who can think the way you think." 6 months later, Elena was promoted to full commander and given command of the newest attack submarine in the Pacific Fleet. The USS Predator was equipped with the most advanced weapons and sensors available, and Elena's crew consisted of volunteers from throughout the submarine force. Men who wanted to serve under the commander who had revolutionized submarine tactics in a single engagement. But Elena's greatest legacy wasn't the tactical innovations she had pioneered or the enemy ships she had sunk. Her greatest legacy was the young female officers who began applying to submarine service, inspired by the knowledge that courage and competence mattered more than gender in the depths of the ocean. The Naval Academy began seeing record numbers of women applying for submarine training, and within 5 years, Female submarine commanders were no longer unusual in the U.S. Navy. Elena had broken more than just tactical barriers. She had broken cultural barriers that had existed since submarines were first invented. 2 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, as historians would later call Elena's engagement, she was invited to speak at the Naval War College about tactical innovation and leadership under pressure. Standing at the podium where her father had once lectured about submarine warfare, Elena looked out at an audience of future naval officers and saw faces that reflected the diversity and capability of the modern Navy. Submarine warfare has always been about thinking differently, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the lecture hall. It's about finding ways to use the ocean itself as a weapon, about turning disadvantages into advantages, about having the courage to attempt tactics that others say are impossible. The enemy will always expect you to follow conventional doctrine, to do what submarine commanders have always done. Your job is to prove them wrong. A young female midshipman in the front row raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you handle people who doubt your abilities because of your gender?" Elena smiled, remembering her own doubts and struggles during her early career. "You prove them wrong through excellence, through results, through absolute dedication to your crew and your mission. You don't let other people's limitations become your limitations. And you, remember that the ocean doesn't care about your gender. It only cares whether you're smart enough and tough enough to survive." After her lecture, Elena walked across the Naval War College campus to the memorial wall where her father's name was inscribed along with other submarine commanders who had given their lives in service to their country. She stood quietly for a moment, thinking about the lessons he had taught her and the legacy she was building on the foundation he had provided. Miha quote. 50 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, the U.S. Naval Institute organized a symposium dedicated to the tactical innovations that had emerged from that engagement. The event was held at the Naval War College, in the same lecture hall where Elena Vasquez had once spoken as a young commander about breaking conventional limitations. Now, the lecture hall bore her name, the Admiral Elena Vasquez Center for Tactical Innovation, and her portrait hung alongside those of other naval legends who had shaped the course of maritime warfare. Captain Sofia Vasquez, Elena's granddaughter, stood at the podium where her grandmother had once challenged conventional thinking about submarine warfare. Sofia had inherited the family's tactical brilliance and had made her own mark on submarine warfare through innovations in underwater drone operations and autonomous submarine systems. She was now the commanding officer of the USS Elena Vasquez, the lead ship of a new class of attack submarines that incorporated technologies that had been science fiction when her grandmother was serving. Admiral Vasquez once said that the ocean doesn't care about artificial limitations, Sofia began, looking out at an audience that included submarine commanders from 30 different nations. She proved that principle through her actions, and she taught us that the key to naval supremacy isn't just having the best technology, it's having the courage to use that technology in ways that the enemy doesn't expect. In the audience sat Admiral Maria Vasquez, Elena's daughter, who had followed her mother's path to flag rank and now served as the commander of submarine forces. Maria had been instrumental in developing the next generation of submarine tactics, building on the foundation her mother had established while adapting to new threats and technologies that emerged in an increasingly complex world. Also in the audience was Master Chief Sarah Chen, who had served as Elena's executive officer decades earlier and had chosen to remain in the enlisted ranks rather than pursuing commissioned officer status. Chen had become the senior enlisted advisor for all submarine operations, and her expertise in tactical systems was legendary throughout the submarine force. She had trained thousands of submarine sailors over her career, passing on the lessons she had learned from Admiral Vasquez about innovation, courage, and the importance of trusting your crew. The symposium included presentations on tactical innovations that had emerged from the Mendocino Ridge engagement, but it also looked forward to the challenges that future submarine commanders would face. The nature of naval warfare was changing rapidly, with new technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum sensors, and directed energy weapons creating possibilities that previous generations of submariners couldn't have imagined. The principles that Admiral Vasquez demonstrated remain as relevant today as they were 50 years ago, said Dr. James Morrison, the son of Elena's former executive officer, and now a professor of naval warfare at the War College. The willingness to think beyond conventional limitations, the importance of training and trusting your crew, the courage to attempt what others believe is impossible. These are timeless principles that will guide naval officers for generations to come. During a break in the symposium, Sofia Vasquez walked to the memorial wall, where her great-grandfather's name was inscribed alongside thousands of other submarine commanders who had served with distinction. The wall had been expanded multiple times over the years and now included names from conflicts around the world, representing the international brotherhood of submarine service that transcended national boundaries. Standing before her great-grandfather's name, Sofia thought about the legacy that connected 4 generations of her family to submarine service. Captain Miguel Vasquez had taught his daughter that the ocean rewarded those who respected its power while refusing to be intimidated by its challenges. Admiral Elena Vasquez had proven that excellence and courage were gender-neutral qualities. Admiral Maria Vasquez had adapted those lessons to new technologies and new threats. And now Sofia was carrying forward the family tradition into an era where submarines operated not just beneath the ocean's surface, but in space, in cyberspace, and in dimensions that earlier generations could barely comprehend. Admiral Vasquez's tactical innovations didn't just change submarine warfare, said Admiral Chen during her presentation to the symposium. They changed the way we think about naval leadership, about innovation, and about the importance of diversity in military thinking. She proved that the best ideas can come from anyone, regardless of their background, and that the military's greatest strength lies in its ability to adapt and evolve. The symposium concluded with the unveiling of a new exhibit at the Naval War College Museum, dedicated to the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge and its impact on modern naval warfare. The centerpiece of the exhibit was a detailed model of the USS Leviathan as it appeared during that famous engagement, surrounded by displays that explained the tactical innovations Elena had pioneered and their continuing influence on submarine operations around the world. But the most moving part of the exhibit was a video presentation featuring interviews with surviving crew members from the USS Leviathan, men who were now in their 80s and 90s but who still spoke with pride about serving under Elena's command. Chief Martinez had passed away several years earlier, but his final interview was included in the presentation, and his words captured the essence of what had made the Leviathan's crew so effective. Admiral Vasquez never asked us to do anything she wouldn't do herself, Martinez had said, his weathered face serious as he recalled that desperate battle decades earlier. She never used her rank to avoid danger, never made decisions just to protect her own career. She led from the front, and she made us all better sailors because we wanted to live up to her example. Sonar technician Rodriguez, now retired but still sharp as ever, had added his own perspective. The Admiral had this way of making you believe that impossible things were possible. She'd look at a tactical situation that seemed hopeless, and she'd find a way to turn it into an opportunity. She taught us that the key to submarine warfare isn't avoiding challenges, it's finding ways to use those challenges to your advantage. 60 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, the Elena Vasquez Institute for Naval Innovation was established at the Naval Academy, dedicated to developing new approaches to maritime warfare and naval leadership. The institute brought together the brightest minds from military and civilian institutions, tasked with preparing the Navy for challenges that couldn't yet be fully imagined. The institute's first director was Admiral Sofia Vasquez, who had risen to flag rank following her grandmother's example of tactical innovation and inspirational leadership. Under Sofia's direction, the institute developed new approaches to submarine warfare that incorporated artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced materials science, creating capabilities that would have seemed magical to earlier generations of submariners. But the institute's most important work wasn't technological, it was human. Sofia and her team developed new training programs that emphasized creative thinking, cultural diversity, and the kind of innovative leadership that Elena had exemplified throughout her career. The programs attracted officers from around the world, creating an international network of naval leaders who shared a commitment to excellence, innovation, and the protection of democratic values. Technology alone doesn't win wars, Sofia would tell her students, echoing lessons she had learned from her grandmother. Wars are won by people who can think clearly under pressure, who can adapt to changing circumstances, and who can inspire others to achieve things they didn't know they were capable of. That's what Admiral Vasquez understood, and that's what made her one of the greatest naval commanders in history. 75 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, the principles Elena had demonstrated continued to influence naval operations around the world. Submarine commanders from dozens of nations studied her tactics not just to understand specific techniques, but to learn how to think creatively about tactical challenges. Her willingness to break conventional rules when the situation demanded it had become a standard part of naval education, and officers who showed similar innovative thinking were often compared to the Vasquez style of leadership. The physical artifacts of Elena's career had become almost legendary within the submarine community. Her tactical manual, with its handwritten notes and worn pages, was preserved in the Naval Academy Museum and was considered one of the most important documents in the history of submarine warfare. The USS Leviathan remained a museum ship at Pearl Harbor, where thousands of visitors each year learned about the battle that had changed naval warfare forever. But Elena's most enduring legacy was the generation of officers she had inspired and trained, officers who now commanded submarines, naval task forces, and entire fleets around the world. These men and women carried forward her commitment to excellence, innovation, and the protection of democratic values, adapting her principles to new challenges and new technologies while maintaining the core values that had made her such an effective leader. 100 years after the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge, historians would look back on Elena's career as a turning point in the evolution of naval warfare and military leadership. Her tactical innovations had transformed submarine operations, but more importantly, her example had proven that excellence and courage could overcome any barrier, that innovation could emerge from unexpected sources, and that the best military leaders were those who understood that strength came from diversity, creativity, and the willingness to challenge conventional thinking. The ocean, as Elena's father had taught her, didn't care about artificial limitations. It only cared about those who were smart enough and tough enough to meet its challenges. Elena Vasquez had been both, and her legacy continued to inspire new generations of naval officers who carried forward her commitment to excellence, innovation, and service to something larger than themselves. In the depths of the Pacific Ocean, where the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge had taken place so many decades earlier, new generations of submarines patrolled the same waters, their crews trained in tactics that Elena had pioneered and inspired by her example of courage, innovation, and unwavering dedication to their mission. The ocean itself seemed to remember her legacy, and submarine commanders who passed through those waters often spoke of feeling connected to the tradition of excellence that she had established. Admiral Elena Vasquez had entered the Navy at a time when her gender made her an anomaly in submarine service. She had risen to the highest ranks through excellence, courage, and the absolute refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose on her. She had broken barriers not through political maneuvering or social pressure, but through competence, innovation, and the simple demonstration that the only qualifications that mattered in naval service were character, courage, and the commitment to something larger than oneself. Her legacy lived on in every submarine that patrolled the world's oceans, in every tactical innovation that emerged from creative thinking, and in every officer who refused to accept that something was impossible simply because it had never been done before. The Admiral had called her a decoration, but Elena Vasquez had proven that she was something far more valuable. She was a warrior, a leader, and an inspiration to all who followed in her wake. The story of the Battle of the Mendocino Ridge would be told and retold for generations, but the most important part of that story wasn't the tactical brilliance or the innovative maneuvers. The most important part was the lesson that Elena Vasquez had lived and taught throughout her career: that excellence has no gender, that courage can overcome any obstacle, and that the greatest victories come to those who refuse to accept limitations that others try to impose on them. In the end, Admiral Elena Vasquez had done more than sink enemy ships or develop new tactics. She had changed the world by proving that barriers existed only in the minds of those who built them, and that determined individuals could break through any obstacle if they had the courage to try and the skill to succeed. Subscribe to Channel Name, where silence is never forgotten. He had whispered to her during his last days in the hospital, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp. The ocean doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It only cares if you're smart enough and tough enough to survive. You are both. Those words had carried her through 7 years of serving under commanders who saw her as an anomaly, through countless training exercises where she had to prove herself over and over again, through the political battles that had finally earned her command of the Leviathan. And now, with her submarine damaged and her crew in danger, Elena knew that she was facing the ultimate test of everything her father had taught her about leadership, courage, and the unforgiving nature of the sea. The intercom crackled, and Chief Martinez's voice filled the control room. "Control, we've bought ourselves some time, but this whole breach is going to get worse before it gets better. I need at least an hour on the surface to make proper repairs, and even then, we're going to be operating with reduced structural integrity." Elena nodded, even though Martinez couldn't see her. An hour on the surface meant an hour exposed to enemy fire. An hour during which the destroyers above could call in air support or additional naval assets. It was a risk that bordered on suicide, but it might be the only chance her crew had of seeing home again. She looked around the control room at the faces of her officers and crew, men who had learned to trust her judgment, men who were depending on her to find a way out of an impossible situation. Lieutenant Morrison was studying the navigation charts, his brow furrowed in concentration as he calculated distances and angles. Rodriguez was bent over his sonar console, his headphones pressed tight against his ears as he listened to the sounds of their hunters circling above. Throughout the submarine, 44 other sailors were doing their jobs with the quiet professionalism that had made the U.S. Submarine Force legendary, trusting that their commander would find a way to bring them home. Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but this time it didn't feel crushing. Instead, it felt like armor, like the accumulated strength of every challenge she had overcome, every doubt she had proven wrong, every man who had learned to respect her leadership. She was Elena Vasquez, daughter of a submarine captain, graduate of the Naval War College, and the only woman ever to command an attack submarine in combat. She had earned her place in this control room through skill, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept limits that others tried to impose on her. The enemy destroyers above thought they were hunting wounded prey. They were about to discover that they had cornered something far more dangerous. A submarine commander who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove.